went into these commands, some of them being, these essential file navigation and movement or management commands, and some being, just interesting things you can do, but you don't do that often. And now we're at the Git part. So just to recap, how do we feel about the Unix stuff? Are people feeling in an okay place? Anything stands out as particularly confusing? My hope is just that, as long as you can navigate up and down the file system, create new files and folders and open VS Code, you're in a pretty good place. Right, so what we're going to do now is talk about Git. And first we want to explain what Git is. So Git is like any other program that you downloaded, an application, and that just like Node or Python, Git is not necessarily built into your system. It's a program that somebody made and that, does something useful. So the useful thing Git does is what we call version control. So if you make a Microsoft Word document, you might write up your document and then you save it, and maybe you make some more edits and you save that, but then you have a question of, do you overwrite your original save, or do you call it something else? For posterity's sake, you probably just want to call it something else, but pretty soon you have 10 versions of the same thing. And I'm sure, modern Microsoft Word tracks this a little better, but ultimately there's this problem where if you're creating some document that changes a lot, which, source code tends to be like that, you're going to be changing things over time. You want to be able to, one, track your changes because you might want to roll back to something. And then the other thing is that you might want to be able to check the difference between one version and another to know exactly what changed. And then another factor of it is sort of like posterity, as in if it all lives on your computer, that's only so safe. Whereas if you have like a backed up copy somewhere else, that's really good. And then there's also the question of collaborating with other people. What if two people are working on the same file at the same time? They both have different changes. How do you combine those? So Git is a tool designed to solve all of these problems. And as a result, it ends up being a very complex tool because we're just going to scratch the surface today of what Git does. And I wouldn't even call myself, or most developers who've been doing this for like 5-6 years, I wouldn't call any of us even intermediate Git understanders, in that Git is such a deep tool that you could learn it your whole life almost, because it's basically solving the problem of managing a multiverse or something. Because you got, you have things that happen and you can go forward or backwards in time, and then things can split. So you have this one version and this other version, and then in the future, those two versions might need to smash together and create a combo version. So it's really the problem of differing and combining timelines, and that's a really complex idea. But okay, before we get into it, a point to note is that Git is not GitHub. So what is Git and what is GitHub? Well, Git is a command line tool that was invented in the 90s by the same guy that invented Linux. He's sort of a savant in the sense that he made all these things that were very forward thinking about the internet well before they were really necessary. And Git is designed so that many programmers working all across the world can collaborate in a way that they're not constantly stepping on each other's toes, and there's a single source of truth. But the thing is, when you use Git, you're creating a version control system that currently exists just on your local computer. And it's a lot better for collaboration and for posterity if it's on some kind of remote server that, it lives somewhere else. And that is not, most people don't want to be maintaining their own servers. So GitHub is kind of this great service that was bought by Microsoft eventually, where for free, you can open up a Git repository that, it has this canonical place that it lives and it's backed up and everyone can collaborate together. And it's also, there's a lot of nice visual tools so you can kind of see what you're doing. because Git is very command line and it's a little harder to visualize. But GitHub, you could think of GitHub as it's a private company essentially that for free is hosting your source code remotely. And Git is the actual tool that anyone can use. It's not owned by anybody. And that's how you actually create one of these repos locally, but it can get a little confusing. So yeah, let's go through it. First thing to note is you don't need to start on GitHub, as in let me just first get rid of this my directory and this test. That's why you do force sometimes. Okay, I don't know what that was. But right, so we're going to try and create a Git repo. So how about to explain this? I mean, this will be useful. You see, I have my I have my source code, or I have my file system here. And then just yesterday, because I started seeing this personal trainer and he's given me this very intense diet I have to be on, I created this little diet calculator program because I prefer programming to following the diet, I guess. And this lets me put that off a little longer. So I created this diet calculator thing, and you'll see it has a bunch of files in there. It does things. If I were to write npm start, it's going to tell me a little bit about what I ate today and what macros I have left to achieve. So as you see, I have an absurd amount of protein to eat in the rest of the day, but that's all specifics. The point is we have a bunch of these files, right? And let's say we want to track this thing as we go. So the first thing I'm going to do is type this command git init, which is going to create a new Git repository. So git init, it might ask me some questions. No, it didn't. It's just saying, hey, I created this file called .git. So I look and nothing is different. But if I do ls-a, I'll see I do have this thing called .git. So that's just a file like any other. I can go in there and look at it. It's got a lot of stuff in here. This isn't stuff I really understand or that you ever should have to go into to see, but you should understand that Git is just that. Git is just a hidden file which is managing this idea of tracking your changes. So you'll also notice that because of the command line I'm in, this whole thing updated. First, it's saying Git to say I'm in a Git, a Git managed repository. Repository just meaning a file or a folder that's tracked by Git. Just a symbol here, but you see it's sort of like a branching symbol because there's this idea of branches in Git, because even though we likely won't get into that today, I'm on the main branch, but I could say, oh, actually, we want to branch off of this, copy everything that's on it, but now we're on something called the development branch or the feature branch. And, we could do some work on that. And then when it's ready, we merge it back into main. But for right now, we're just on main. And then I have this $10, which I believe means I've got 10 items it wants me to make a decision about. So that brings us to our next point, which is git status. So git status is going to be the command you are constantly running. I think it's good advice in the beginning that every time you run another command, right after it, run git status and read what it says, because that's the only way you really learn the ideas that Git uses to understand, what it's talking about. So I'm going to type git status and I'll read it. Okay, it's telling me I'm on branch main, no commits yet. We'll get into the commits in a second. And then it's saying untracked files. So I have these 10 files and they're untracked, meaning that as far as Git's concerned, it doesn't even know what this file is. It's not paying attention to it. So if I want to track these files, if I want Git to start paying attention to them, I can add them. So I can say something like git add food item.ts. And then if I did git status again, it's saying, okay, I know about this new file called food item. And here's the command if you want to unstage it, i.e. it's not tracking it anymore. But now I have all these other files and I could type them in individually, but very often you're going to do something like git add dot, which just means add the whole current folder to Git, including anything hidden. And I can do that. Took a second. Wow, it's saying 487 files. That's actually gigantic and probably not what I want. So I'll say git status, right? I didn't realize I have this thing called node modules. It's all these other things I downloaded that, my thing depends on, but I don't really want to keep track of all of that. honestly, I didn't expect to get into this, but it seems like what I want to do is type git remove dash dash cache and then the name of the folder. So git remove dash dash cache. And then it was node modules. Doesn't like that. It wants me to give it an R. Maybe now if I say git status. Okay, cool. It knows about these files. And then there's one untracked. I'm happy with that right now. So the next thing I would want to do is something like git commit. So what I've done so far is what we call staging. Is that I took a bunch of these files and I said, okay, Git, now you know about these files. But as far as Git is concerned, there is no history. So if I look at this next command, and you don't end up using this command very often, more often than not, you'll use GitHub. But I can write git log. So git log is going to tell me what's up and saying, okay, well, you're on this branch main, but it doesn't even have any commits yet, so there's nothing to tell you. So how do I say, okay, I want you to create a new version? That's called a commit. So I could say git commit, and you'll notice if I just write git commit, it's going to say waiting for your editor. So what it's going to do is it's going to take all of these files and it's going to explain a little bit about what it's doing. And then it's going to create this, because of how we set up that default editor, it's going to create this, it's going to open this in Visual Studio Code, which is a commit edit message. And it's going to want me to save it. And if I do save it, normally it would then commit. But as you noticed, it's giving me this error about like aborting because of an empty commit message. Well, that's okay, because in general, I never use that whole thing. I just do this -m, which means message. And you just say your little message, which is how you essentially communicate to your team what work you did. You don't want to make it too meaningless, but in this case, because it's my first commit, I'll write something like first commit. It's not a great commit message, but it'll do. And it's saying, okay, well, I just, created all this stuff. So now if I say git status, it says on branch main, and there's some untracked files, just node modules, but the rest of it is understood. And then if I say git log, it says, okay, you have one commit. And this is some information about that commit. And this big number here is what we call the hash. You generally don't have to use it, but this is the unique ID of that specific point in history as far as Git is concerned. So every now and then you'll have to do git log, find this specific number and reference it, but pretty rarely. Okay, so we have our Git repository and we have our, what do you call it? We have our first commit. So what now? Well, this only exists on my computer. That's not ideal, maybe. So this is where GitHub comes in, and we might want to create some kind of remote place for this to live. So I'm going to go to GitHub. As you see, I need an account. I'll put this in my personal account. So here's a Buddha. Okay, we're going to say new repository. And I'm going to create this repository. And I mean, I'm actually going to use this at some point in the future. So diet calculator. Okay. Doesn't really matter what it's called, just that no one else, or that you yourself have not already named a project this. Might as well give it a description, a calculator for keeping track of diet macros. Okay, public or private. You're generally going to want to choose public just because the nature of private is that it's harder to share with other people, and GitHub will eventually charge you money if you want to have too many private repos. So when you're working in a company, it'll probably be private, but for your own personal stuff, you want it to be public because it's sort of your resume. It's how you show off, hey, I did something. Cool, it's going to ask me to initialize it. I'm going to not choose anything to initialize it with because I already have this local thing I want to push to it. So create repo. And now all this did was create something that GitHub knows about, a URL basically where I can save this stuff, but there's currently nothing there. But it's telling me a little bit about what to do in order to set it up. So it's saying, assuming that this is the case of you don't have anything yet, but this is my case. I already have a repository. So it's saying first do this command git remote add origin URL. Okay, so I'm gonna copy paste that. I type that in. And so what is this doing? This is saying, okay, in Git, we're gonna have a subcommand called remote. Remote means it's some server that's not local to you. So in this case, the GitHub server. I want to add a new remote location. I'm going to call it origin because that's, for whatever reason, that's the standard. Just like calling your main branch main is the standard, calling your main external remote repository, whatever, origin is standard. So we're going to call it origin. And here's what it points to, which is a URL where this is going to live. Cool. And once I do that, I believe I can say something like, I just write git remote. I don't know if I have to, yeah, and it knows about it. It knows about this thing called origin. Cool, so now that I have that, I have access to two more, or I have meaningful access to two more commands, push and pull. And they do probably what you would expect, as in currently I have stuff living on my local computer that doesn't exist in Git. So I'm gonna put this over here. And you'll see, okay, this doesn't, this is just a blank page. Don't have to worry about this stuff, but right, I want to say git push origin main, and it's actually not going to work. It's just going to, oh, okay, it worked. Usually, I think the reason why the U is here is because usually it's going to say, hey, there's actually nothing called main on origin yet. It wants you to first set up that branch remotely, but I guess main is automatic at this point. So basically, I just said, git, I want you to push, to this remote repository origin, everything that is on the branch main. And now if I go here and I reload, it's actually here. It knows about it. It's got all this commit stuff, and then I could even see things. So this is the value of GitHub that I could say, like, this was a popular thing. Someone could log an issue. Or, there's just a bunch of stuff. I mean, you can make it so that every time there's a push, some kind of action kicks off with like another tool. Insights, as you see, I'm the only one contributing. No one else is doing work on this project. But yeah, there's loads of useful things like that. And if you had more history or more branches, you can look at all your branches and you could say like, I could look at the history of this file and like how things have changed. The effect's not obvious right now, but but here's the thing. So going back here, you'll see, okay, so I did push, but what about pull? Pull is when there's a change on the remote side and you need it locally. So if I were to say git pull right now, I don't think I have to say, or no, it does want me to. So I could say git pull origin main, and it will do that. And if I say git pull, it doesn't like that, but it says that if I say something like git, no, I don't want to do that. I don't know what that is. But yeah, if I say git pull, it's saying, okay, I guess it needs that. I'm saying git branch -- set upstream to equals origin / main. So I guess it needs this where I'm saying, okay, on the remote repository, there should be a branch called main, and I want you to link it to my local branch called main, so that in the future, when I say git pull, it just understands. But anyways, it's already up to date, so there's nothing to change. But looking here, I mean, if I had other contributors, they could contribute and maybe that would cause me to be out of date. But what if right here it's saying, people want to understand what your thing does, add a README. So I'm going to click add README. And this is, okay, it's a calculator for keeping track of diet macros. I am hoping to add some kind of logging system and no, not logging system. I'm hoping to add some kind of Work on this. Okay, not important. But yeah, so there's this, file README that I'm going to create, and I could, create a new commit right here. And I'm just going to take the default create README is enough of a commit history. I'm going to say commit new file. Okay, so you see like everything else happened 8 minutes ago, but this one happened now. And that means that over here is no longer up to date. So if I say git pull, it's going to say, okay, I noticed there were things in that remote that I don't have, and I pulled them for you, and it's called README, and we didn't run into any, kind of conflict. So let's say I have something local that looks one way, and I have something here that looks another way, and they can't merge them so easily. You get into what's called a conflict, but we'll get into more of that stuff later. The basic idea is seeing this flow of you have something locally, you have something remotely, and the remote is the source of truth that you're either going to push your changes to or pull any changes anyone else made to. Yeah, so that's all the basic commands. The only one we didn't talk about is git clone. So you already saw git clone a little in the install fast, but basically git clone is a way of, DID calculator is something that I created myself. And so I had to push it to GitHub. But let's say there's something that already exists on GitHub. So if I, look for a popular repository like React, I don't know why I can't find that. No, oh yeah, all of GitHub, okay. Yeah, so Facebook seems to make this thing called React. I can look into it. It looks long. It looks involved. Let's see how many stars it has. Ooh, 202,000 stars. That's more than I've ever gotten. I think I've gotten like 40 at best or something. But cool. So I can click code, and we have our GitHub CLI, which is, sort of the standardized approach now. But still, we have this original thing which just tells us, okay, by HTTPS, we have this URL, and Git understands this. So I can say something like git clone that. So I'm in here, and I'm going to say git clone, and I'm going to give it a URL, and it should be able to go to that URL, find that repository, and download it all locally. By default, it'll call it exactly what this is, which is React, but I can also call it, my own name. But I'll just call it React for simplicity's sake. So it's going to do this process, which, can sometimes take a while because that might be a very large project. Might take too long. Could have chosen a smaller one, I bet, but do we dare wait for this? Let's see, if I just went into my own repositories, I could probably much sooner. We're not going to wait for this. It's not terribly important. But let's say I had something of my own called Monad tutorial. I like that one. So this is my own thing, and I can grab the URL, and I can say git clone this thing. And in a second, because it's much smaller, it's done. You go in there and you see it's a Git thing like anything else. And I can change something to it. So I can say like code README all the way down. Stop it. And just say something like, I never finished. And this is the same as the last comment. I'll save that. And then like before, I say git status. I see that I changed something. I'm going to add that thing I changed, git status again. Now it knows about it. I can say git commit changed even more. I do that a lot. Dot is not a command, and it doesn't know what I'm talking about. And then I'll say git push, and I think it's all set up, and it will just go right to that branch. You'll see it's called master here. We like to the modern thing is that you name it main. No one wants to call it master anymore. You can generally modify that, but I think by default, any new repository Git creates will be called main. Yeah, that's everything in terms of the basics of Git that's going to allow you to get up and running in terms of doing the assignments and things like that. So eventually you might learn a little bit more about things like branching or things like pull requests. Like I said, it ends up being a very complex tool, and it's really designed for teams more than anything. So when you're working on something alone, it's not that complicated. You don't need to know that much, but when you're working on a large project, like for example, let's look at React again. That if I search for React is something made by Facebook, and it's open source. So this is actually, why is it not showing me? Okay, this is where they're actually doing things. So if we looked into it deeply, we could see, like, let's just, go for a random file here, like readme, okay? And then I believe we can look at the history. So it's saying there's been, 56 contributors overall, and I can look at the history, and I can see, every change that's ever been made to the file, and it probably goes back and back and back. There's this thing called blame. I don't love the name of it, but it is meaningful in that it will tell you who is the last person to touch every single line. So for better or worse, in the field of software development, there's a really easy accountability tool. You always know who is responsible for the last creation of that line. And you just kind of, GitHub is a really good tool for seeing visually what the collaborative nature and history of these tools are. So you could see, this is a living project. So there's currently, this is huge compared to any normal project, but there's 259 unique features that are currently in some kind of waiting zone that have not yet been merged into the main thing. But, people who work at Facebook, I guess, are working on it. And there's 922 issues that people have brought up that people want fixed. But, 11,095 have been closed, not necessarily solved. But as you can see, it's like Git versus GitHub. GitHub is this tool that really allows you to interact collaboratively on really big projects, whereas Git is sort of the local tool that lets you work with it as an individual once it's on your computer. So that's the essence of Git, and you're not going to understand it all today, and it's going to take a fair amount of time until you do. As I mentioned before, I tend to have this attitude of, you want to get good at the command line version before you use the visual version. Although, as you can see here, there's a pretty good visual version as far as I don't want to see this, but as far as Visual Studio is concerned, it will like track your things and allow you to just click a button that says commit. So, there are decent visual tools out there. The number one rule of Git is just, if you are not sure what you're doing and you Google, how do I do this? And you wind up at Stack Overflow and someone says, just type this command. You want to be really careful about typing a command with Git that you don't understand, because much like the remove command, Git is about tracking your history, and its most powerful commands can destroy your history or otherwise alter the history in a way that you can't get it back. And so if you put in the wrong command, you can end up in a situation where, especially when you're on a team, and I had this experience myself, which is why I feel this way. You can destroy not just like 6 hours of your time, but you can destroy work that other people did, and they will not be happy about that. So it's like, it's really a very powerful tool to be careful with. But yeah, that being said, I'm sure you guys have questions. What can I do to help you understand Git a little better? Or what are just some questions we have about Git right now?
Benjamin, I had a question regarding what you did at the end there with that monad example.
Yeah.
So you cloned it to your local area, and then you were able to, you did something locally, you made a change to one of those files and then you pushed it back up.
Yep.
That's because you own it, right? Like just pushing things back to a remote repository willy-nilly, that's usually something that has some controls around it itself, right?
Yeah, that's a great question / point, which is yeah, exactly. Because I own that, I have full admin responsibilities over it. I believe if I went into like projects here, or no, that's not where it is, but basically if you go into the settings for a project, you can find out who is an admin and has, you know, all the rights, who's just like a member, and maybe they have some rights. For instance, like on the Tango curriculum, originally only Zainab was an admin, and I made some changes to the curriculum and I tried to push them, and it said, sorry, you don't have, you can't just push to main. Who do you think you are? You can clone this, you can pull from it, but you can't just push your changes because you haven't proven you're worthy. And so, right, you have to generally be added by someone who is an owner of the project. And that's also this interesting point. This thing here called a pull request is sort of the general solution to the idea of people who don't have that level of access trying to get something merged. So while for a project I own, I can just say, you know, push whatever my changes are to main and overwrite whatever is on there, because I know that my stuff is the newest and best. A pull request is a thing where you say, hey, Facebook, I made these changes because I think they're good. I'm going to send you a pull request, which basically means you, the owner, or whoever's in charge of this repository at Facebook, can read my pull request. They can review my code. And if they like it, they can click yes, and they pull my changes. So instead of me pushing to them, I don't have access. Instead, they have the right to choose to pull my changes when they want them.
And I know you didn't touch on it a little bit. I think you said we would later, but the concept of branching. So that would, I guess, play in with pools too, right? Like if I decide to branch off and do my own thing, and then I realize a point where I feel comfortable with maybe pushing it back out, I would submit a pull request that they would pull from that branch and update it. And I don't want to cross any wires and get too ahead of it and whatnot, because I don't understand it fully, but is that sort of how it would work?
Yeah, pretty close. I mean, first we'll see that, like, if I look here, look how many branches there are, just an insane number of branches. Because every time at a professional organization, generally, if you're creating a new feature, you don't create that feature on main. You don't even create that feature on the dev branch. Instead, you create that, you start at the dev branch, you branch off of it, which means you take everything on the dev branch, but now it's a new environment. You make your changes, you push those to a remote, to the remote repository, but, you know, given the name of your branch, and then you set up the pull request, because maybe it's going to take weeks before someone can review it and look at it. And so it safely lives on that branch. But we can talk about branching a little in that here we are. I could say git branch, and it's going to tell me all you have is this thing called master. So I can say something like, if you want to create a new branch, one way to do that is git checkout -b. Normally git checkout will check out a new branch. So I'm already there, but if I said git checkout -b, that means create a new branch. I'm going to call it feature. And now you see here, it says I'm on the feature branch. So I could say something like touch funfile.hs. I don't even think I need to add anything to it. If I just say git status, it's going to say, hey, we have this new file. So I'm going to say, okay, git add that file, git commit -m new feature. Hey, I did something wrong there with hey, new feature. I said git log. It has all my previous logs, but now it has this new feature. I noticed that these previous ones were on master.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it'll give you the
Yeah, and so at this point, I could say something like git push. It's going to say, sorry, you need to create a branch on origin called feature. I go back here. What was that called? Monad tutorial. No, my monad tutorial. Almost, okay. Yeah, so if I look here, it's going to say like, okay, you have this other thing called feature. And if I look, this is still just as it was, but if I look at feature, it now has that new file. And you see like GitHub is already saying like, hey, maybe you want to compare and do a pull request. So maybe I do want to do that. I could click on that and I could say like, okay, I'm creating this new pull request called new feature. Maybe I add some reviewers. So like if Zainab is part of my organization, I say, Zainab's a reviewer, so let her know it's ready for review. She'd look at it and say, okay, let me see what changed. Okay, you added one file, it's an empty file. So she might go back here and say, this is a meaningless change. It's not even good English. But let's say she writes that and then she has a change of heart and says, you know what, he's a good guy. Let's just merge his pull requests. So, it's filling everything out. Say confirm merge. I'm just making sure. And it says right here, it says wants to merge one commit into master from feature. Great, you're all set. It's even saying, hey, you don't need that feature branch anymore. Might as well delete it. So GitHub makes it really easy to do stuff like that now. I look in here, I actually have this fun file now. And if I were to look locally, I'd go back here and I'd say, well, I don't want to be on feature branch anymore. Notice I still have the feature branch here because I deleted it on my remote, but it's still locally. But I'll say git, oops. I want to say git checkout master. And it's saying that, but it's wrong. So if I say git pull, it's going to find it and it's going to grab that file. And now I have it. So yeah, that's the basic workflow of why you would want to branch and then the pull request thing. But really that stuff doesn't matter until you're in a team generally. And it's very, I feel like people hold it, a senior developer should be holding your hand on that for a fair amount of time because you can do a lot of damage by having full Git access, and they want to know when you push and make sure they do a real code review because it's on them if you get like terrible code and just push it to the main branch. So yeah, that's it basically.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions along the lines of Git?
When you checked out the master, or when you pulled it again, you were saying that wasn't the case up top. Did it I guess you had to do pull again and then it overwrote the feature. Is that right? It's all the way up top. So git checkout master. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have no idea why it doesn't. It's saying your branch is up to date, but it just doesn't know. I don't know why it is saying that. Because how could it know that there's something far away that changed that it doesn't yet know about?
Okay.
Yeah. Was that your question?
Yeah, and then when you did pull, what happened to the feature branch, the old one up top?
Okay, the feature branch locally or remotely?
Locally.
It's still there. So if I did git checkout feature, nothing about that has changed. And I can even pull from that, but there are no. Oh yeah, because I deleted it remotely. Basically nothing about that has changed. The pull request thing is sort of a GitHub idea and branching is just a local Git idea. So feature is just saying, I'm making this new thing because it's separate than main because I want to have this separate branch locally and there's going to be a separate branch remotely, but long term, it's eventually going to get merged into some main branch. And in a professional organization, there's usually some system by which this stuff happens automatically. So like the developers will only have access to the dev branch, or like they'll make features and then they'll be pull requested into the dev branch. And then the QA people will have access to the test branch. And so there's, once you push to the dev branch, it automatically updates the test branch, and then the QA people can look at it. And then the actual boss or someone with real authority is going to have access from pushing something from the test branch that is approved to the production branch because the production branch is what actually creates the website that people see. So that's the core reason to branch is to have these different levels of like what really matters, what can be in sort of a sloppy, you know, currently being made state. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, before we finish today's lecture, because I believe we're more or less out of time, right, Zainab? I just want to say this is so much, and believe me, like I feel for you that it's a little overwhelming, because when I was learning the program, I did it at first at like a community college, and I spent like 3 months just on if statements and for loops, and I liked that pace because you learn things a little at a time, and this is extremely advanced stuff as far as I'm concerned. It's just that it's the basics of what you need in order to first interact with your operating system, and then to interact with this remote thing, you know, for the sake of pushing your assignments to somewhere we can see. But you're not supposed to really understand either of these deeply, because we sort of, you know, I mean, you're really jumping in at the deep end just because that's where the useful stuff is. And once we go into, you know, tomorrow and the day after, like we get, as you see, you know, JavaScript intro to intermediate, Python intro, like these are a little more just like you're dealing with your language, you're understanding something at a deeper level, but that is much more understandable and sort of like contained.